afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's discussion we have the relationship between discrimination and caste in higher education. For reference, we are going to refer to Professor Satish Deshpande's article published in EPW titled Exclusive Inequalities, Merit, Caste and Discrimination in Higher Education. So, the topic is to understand the relationship between caste and higher education. And we know that higher education system in India suffers from structural and systematic inequalities. Caste discrimination, though legally prohibited, continues to shape the educational experience of students from marginalized community. So, we are aware of the fact that caste untouchability got abolished with the constitution and there was protective discrimination given to members of the certain caste and community. But despite that, after several years of independence, we still face caste inequality, and here the reference is to higher education. Caste-based discrimination continues to affect the access to educational opportunities and the lived experience of students from marginalized caste. Affirmative action or reservation in higher education have failed to provide opportunity for historically oppressed class. Satish Deshpande, in the article titled Exclusive Inequalities, Caste, Discrimination and Higher Education, delves into the structural and systematic inequalities that persist in India's higher education system with a particular focus on caste. Now, the reason why he is entering into the debate of understanding the relationship between caste and higher education is to understand the background of this debate, and that is with the several years of protective discrimination, there were ideas or there were a kind of objection to the reservation of post for in higher education for members of certain caste, and this is a kind of a negation of that rejection of protective discrimination. So, the argument is that it is necessity. And why is reservation necessity? Because the system itself has been exclusive and inequality is inherent in higher education. So, the work here refers to how caste discrimination, though legally prohibited, continues to shape the educational experience of students from OBC, SC category. And in that context, Professor Deshpande uses the framework of exclusive inequality and situates the issue of caste within the broader historical context of India's social and educational system. So, he is going to refer to certain data which are going to tell us the nature or the hierarchy of the system in higher education. So, he is kind of important, such an understanding is necessity. Why? Because there are a lot of debates which kind of says that caste has disappeared from Indian society. However, the work like that of Professor Deshpande suggests that it is crucial to understand the ongoing challenges of caste-based discrimination in India higher education, and also kind of use this study and the data to support the necessity of having protective discrimination in India. So, this calls for an equitable policies, greater sensitivity to the needs of the marginalized students, and a re-evaluation of the so-called meritocracy. So, through the lecture, we will understand the true nature of meritocracy. Is merit necessary only refers to the competition and examination, or how meritocracy has become almost illusion, and there is a lot of structural inequality which affects the idea of meritocracy in academia. So, in this article has been referred widely in academic discussions on caste, affirmative action and social justice in education. So it is essential reading for those who are interested in understanding sociology, education policy, the nature of caste system in India, and the intersection of caste and inequality. So we have caste, inequality, discrimination with the context of higher education. If we look into some of the key themes in Deshpande's work, the number one is to understand the relationship between caste and meritocracy. Professor Deshpande challenges the notion of meritocracy in Indian higher education, arguing that caste privilege often masquerades as merit. So, the argument would kind of tell us that even the idea of merit is colored with the identity of a caste or belonging to a particular community or to a certain privileged caste. The second theme is that much of the students who are kind of privileged to be part of the upper caste are likely to have access to better primary and secondary education, which gives them an advantage in higher education. So, we kind of limit the idea of merit through examination, but the performance in the examination depends on the privilege that a student has been able to acquire. So, if primary and secondary level education is not equitable and there is discrimination there, one will get benefited over the others. Now, this kind of a question is to kind of go back and understand the meaning of merit, and does merit really means in the context of equally assessing the knowledge, skills and requirements of students. Another important theme in his work is affirmative action and reservation. So, we know that the constitutional provision protecting the categories or certain community is affirmative in an attempt to improve the social economic position of these community. Now, what is important is to understand whether the reservation is a necessity or is a mechanism to ensure affirmative action. And in this context, Deshpande discusses the role of reservation in creating opportunities for marginalized castes to access higher education. He acknowledges that the reservation system has played a crucial role in enabling students from SC, ST and OBCs to enter prestigious institutions that were once the exclusive domain of upper caste. However, he also highlights the limitation of the reservation policy. The first limitation is that there is often fierce resistance to reservation from upper caste groups who claim that it dilutes merit and leads to inefficiency in the educational institution. Second, Deshpande argues that while reservation addresses formal access to higher education, they do not necessarily ensure equal participation within these institutions. Many students from reserved categories may be viewed as undeserving or less capable due to their reserved category status, leading to social stigmatization and academic marginalization. The third theme in Deshpande's work is cultural capital. Now, Professor Deshpande borrows the concept of cultural capital from Piri Bourdieu, who has used the idea of capital in the non-material context in terms of the heritage, values, norms that we attach to a particular institution, and here education is seen as a capital. The more we invest in education, educating the children and the younger generation, it will reap more benefit, more profit. And that is where he is saying that the students from the marginalized community lack the cultural capital. The system does not ensure sufficient cultural capital for them to progress and kind of be ahead the upper caste in academics. So, Deshpande argues that upper caste students often possesses more cultural capital familiarity with the norms, language, and behavior expected in elite academic environments, which give them an advantage over students from marginalized community. The fourth theme in his work is structural inequality. The article emphasizes that caste-based discrimination is not just an individual bias, but a structural issue. That is, the structures itself are kind of unequal. So, it is not an individual choice to kind of be unequal or be equal, but the system generates a situation where there is a inequality between two communities. So, the entire educational system, including policies, curriculum, institutional practices, is influenced by caste hierarchy, and that is what perpetuates inequality. So, basically the dominance of the upper caste in at one particular point of time has percolated. So, the upper caste was dominant, they were the ones who were framing policies, the framework and curriculum, and in this formation itself the inequality got inbuilt or it breeded, and now it is kind of difficult to do away with this inbuilt systematic inequality. Now, these arguments or the findings that Professor Satish Deshpande is referring to is based on the analysis of data from sample survey, which is NSSO, which is 1999 to 2000. This is large scale sample survey conducted all over India on the nature of the prevalence of caste in higher education, and this data was collected from graduate and postgraduates in urban India. The findings of the studies refers that Hindu upper caste individuals account for a disproportionate percentage of highly educated individuals. At the time the data was collected, the population of the upper caste was only 37%, but they occupied a disproportionately large share of the higher educated institutions. Hindu upper caste individual dominated higher education with significantly high numbers compared to other caste group. And basically this dominance of the upper caste was seen in the fields like engineering and medicines. Hindu upper caste individual, they outnumbered all the other caste, for the non upper caste, the Hindu SCs, Muslims and Christians and other minorities. So, they were kind of less in numbers, and the dominance was of Hindu upper caste. Since the Hindu upper caste are heavily overrepresented among the highly educated, some other caste and communities have got to be underrepresented. So, on one side we have the Hindu upper caste as dominant and overrepresented. On the other side we have the Hindu SCs and the non-Hindus as being unrepresented or underrepresented. So, the Hindu SCs are the most severely affected. Almost 13% of the urban population, they are less than 4% in all fields and only around 2% in engineering and medicines. Other communities like Sikhs and Christians are overrepresented in higher education, but they make up a small percentage of the urban population. Now, we have tried to understand that the data collected by NSSO is reflecting a crisis. And what is this crisis or what is the problem? The problem was to understand what is at stake or what was in stake in Mandal 2. Now, the Mandal Commission had suggested reservation of seats for the OBCs and the reserved category, and Mandal 2 was kind of a debate whether the reservation should continue after several decades of the protective discrimination being guaranteed. And according to Professor Deshpande, the problem doesn't start with understanding what the reservation was, but the story begins, the story of Mandal 2 begins with a differential representation of different castes in higher education, and this differential representation was not something which took place post Mandal Commission, but it was there through the history. So, there is a historical understanding of the nature of higher education, and the findings suggest a differential representation, and it has been found that they are underrepresented, are different and unequal in terms of their access to higher education. The indifferent representation has survived long after the abolition of caste, and this proves that these must be the product of durable, self-reproducing mechanism that are systematic. It's not random or accidental, and systemic. So, the unequal representation of the upper caste and the other caste is both systematic and systemic. Systemic means that it is related to the system properties rather than to the attributes of individual. So, the core argument of Professor Deshpande is that inequality is not individual, or it is not kind of experienced by one individual, it is a part of the entire system. It is the properties of the higher education that has kind of led to the persistence of caste based discrimination, and that is the reason why he is supporting the call for giving special protective reservation for the members of the marginalized community. Now, when we kind of understand that the study has been then the argument, let us understand some of the core concepts. One of the concepts to understand the idea of caste based discrimination is competing inequalities. Now, if we look into the compensatory discrimination policies in independent India, it can be defined as competing equalities. Competing inequalities because it is kind of stresses on continuing caste inequalities and outlines the specificity of this sector and its peculiarity in the Indian context. Merit and the modalities of examination are seen as contributing to the legitimation of caste discrimination in higher education. Professor Deshpande further outlines the reason why the specificity of higher education require us to think in terms of inequalities and exclusion rather than equality and competition. So, the structure is unequal and the system has been such that they have excluded or kept the marginalized community out of the system. So, we cannot understand the problem by looking into the debates of equality and competition, but rather we need to kind of problematize inequality and exclusion, and then understand what what it has for the affirmative action policies. Now, inequalities and exclusion have to be understood with reference to the idea of merit and the caste and the centrality to ideological contestation and the practical maneuvering going on in the public funded and higher professional education today. The existence of inequality and discrimination may be necessary, but it is not sufficient to prove the existence of injustice. So, the differences are there, the inequality is inherent in the system, but that is not the end of it. The problem arises that this systematic and systemic inequality further leads to injustice, and that is where it has to be re-examined from a policy context, where policies have to be reframed or kind of re-strengthened to ensure that the ideal or the objective is kind of maintained. The word discrimination bears both good and bad things, prejudiced or malicious bias, as well as discernment or the ability to distinguish better from worse. So, you are discriminating, it could be if you are discriminating for giving access to certain resources, it can be good, but on the other side if you see it, it also leads to prejudice and it can be malicious. Some forms of inequalities and discrimination are considered just and desirable. For example, unequal pay for unequal work. Those who work more should be paid more and vice versa. Inequality and discrimination have resulted in the dominance of the Hindu UC in higher education, but it is not known whether it is not legitimate or good. So, that is how can we kind of consider this inequality within the caste system and higher education as kind of legitimate or being malicious to one community versus the other. So, if the gatekeeping mechanism is favoring the upper caste, is it because it is doing its job well or because it is malfunctioning? This is essentially the nature of the split between the two opposing sides in Mandal 2. So, the two opposing side is one who are arguing for the withdrawal of the protective discrimination versus the other group which are kind of in favor of continuing the protective discrimination, as it has not actually benefited the community as much as it was wizened. While the fact of upper caste dominance is undeniable, implicitly or explicitly conceded by both sides, one claim that this dominance is perfectly justified and the other claim that it is unjust. And this is where it kind of has to be taken into a serious discourse, because it is kind of talking about injustice to a community on the account of social and economic resources and entitlement. So, if we see in reverse, the institution of reservation for OBCs in the elite higher education is seen by the upper caste as a travesty of justice, indeed as the perpetration of injustice. The lower caste, on the other hand, see it as long arm of justice finally catching up with the unfairly privileged upper caste. So, when we look into the debate, we have understood the problem. The problem is that there is a systematic discrimination, and this discrimination is not beneficial, but it is malicious, or it is kind of has a negative impact or consequences, and the consequences is that it kind of leads to injustice. Now, we need to understand the specificities of the higher education which has led to the ingrainment of the discrimination and inequality. The first specificity of higher education that Professor Deshpande refers is that higher education is not a fundamental right. Unlike primary education, healthcare or similar basic needs, higher education is not a matter of right. So, you cannot go to the court and claim that the state has to provide you admission in IIT or any other higher education institution. So, no person of any caste or community has a right to become a doctor, engineer or other kind of highly educated person. The second specificity is that admission to higher education is selective and involves elitism. Everyone has the right to aspire to such status and to fair and equal consideration in the admission process, according to specified norms of fairness and equality, but no one has a priori right to actual admission. Higher education is not accessible to all individuals as a matter of right. From the point of view of both efficiency and ethic, higher education is not an universalizable resource. So, it is not kind of available to everyone. There has to be a system where only a selected few have access to it. There will be always be a funnel effect. More will want to get into the system, and the system cannot accommodate all. So, at least some of them will be turned away. Now, the way it has worked out, and if we look into the history of the higher education, is that the tunnel turns to turn away or kind of exclude the students from the marginalized community. So, this will remain, this kind of funnel effect will continue to be there more or less kind of even if India miraculously turns into a rich and overdeveloped nation. So, the argument that Professor Deshpande is making is that it is not the scarcity of resources, but it is the scarcity of the way the people have kind of kept these ideals of caste system alive in their thinking. So, if we look into the modalities of discrimination in higher education, we know that there are certain institutional mechanisms regulating entry, and these entries are often based on scholastic examination. So, the number of seats in the higher educations are restricted. Who gets access to it is determined through a scholastic examination. So, admission to any particular institution of higher education, you have to write an exam which is conducted the countrywide level, and in that you have to perform at a certain level, at a certain minimum qualification in order to be admitted into it. So, in most societies and contexts, institutional mechanism regulating entry into higher educations are based in practice on some form of kind of written, oral or any kind of, so there is a notion of merit there. Higher education in India is inherently exclusive field, as the modes of exclusions are built into the fundamental structure as a matter of principle. Discrimination in the sense of principal exclusion is thus the defining feature of education. The notion of merit is used to legitimize exclusionary system. The examination plays a significant role in determining this kind of exclusion. So, we have kind of understood the relationship between caste and higher education, and also try to understand how the systematic inequality has kind of perpetrated the marginalization of the large number of students from the reserved category, and therefore, Professor Satish Deshpande argument that this is kind of systematic exclusive inequality in higher education. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.